Kethral stood at the viewing window of the transport ship and watched the stars pass by. His forearms were folded across his chest, and his yellow eyes showed no emotion. He was a Valorian, a member of a proud reptilian race that had traveled the stars for thousands of years. His people were known for their logic, their discipline, and their cold hearts. They did not waste time on feelings. Feelings were for weaker species. The transport was taking him to his new assignment. The Galactic Council had ordered all member species to send soldiers to defend a border world called Thessara 4. A terrible enemy called the Scorn Collective was attacking, and they needed every warrior they could find. Kethral had been chosen to join a mixed force of different alien races. He would serve aboard a human ship called the Resolute Dawn. He did not like this assignment. Not at all. Among the many species of the galaxy, humans were considered the least impressive. They were small. They were weak. They lived short lives and spent most of that time being emotional about everything. They laughed, they cried, they loved, they hated. It was exhausting just to think about. The Valorians tolerated humans because the Council required it, but they did not respect them. No one really did. Kethral had heard stories about humans, of course. They had joined the galactic community only 200 years ago, which made them very young compared to most species. They had spread across many worlds and built a small but growing empire. Some said they were clever. Some said they were stubborn. But no one said they were strong or special in any meaningful way. The transport docked with the Resolute Dawn an hour later. Kethral gathered his weapons and his gear and walked through the airlock. The human ship was smaller than Valorian vessels, and the corridors were narrow. Everything smelled strange, like sweat and metal and something else he could not name. He wrinkled his snout in distaste. A human officer met him at the docking bay. She was a female with short brown hair and tired eyes. She wore a gray uniform with several badges on her chest. "You must be Kethral," she said. Her voice was friendly, but Kethral did not care about friendly. "Welcome aboard. I'm Lieutenant Amy Grant. I'll take you to meet your squad." Kethral said nothing. He simply nodded and followed her through the ship. The squad was waiting in a small room filled with weapons and equipment. There were 3 humans sitting around a metal table, and they all looked up when Kethral entered. He studied them with his cold yellow eyes. The first human was a large male with broad shoulders and a square jaw. His hair was cut very short, and there were scars on his hands. He looked tired, like a warrior who had seen too many battles. This was Sergeant Danny Vance, the squad leader. The second human was a female with red hair and sharp green eyes. She had a quick smile, but there was something hard underneath it. Her fingers tapped the table like she was always ready to move. This was Corporal Katie Marsh. The third human was younger than the others. He was maybe 22 years old, with messy dark hair and a nervous energy about him. He tried to look confident, but Kethral could see the fear hiding behind his eyes. This was Private Ben Torres. Danny stood up and extended his hand. Kethral knew this was a human greeting, so he reached out with one of his 4 arms and shook it briefly. "Good to have you with us," Danny said. His voice was calm and steady. "We've heard good things about Valorian warriors." "I will do my duty," Kethral replied. His voice was flat and cold. "That is all." Katie raised an eyebrow. "Not much for small talk, huh?" "Talk is a waste of energy," Kethral said. "We are here to fight, nothing more." Ben laughed nervously. "Well, this is going to be fun." Over the next few days, Kethral learned more about his human companions. He watched them train, eat, and interact with each other. They were strange creatures, these humans. They joked with each other constantly, even about serious things. They shared meals together and talked about their families back home. Danny had a daughter on Earth who was learning to ride a bicycle. Katie had a brother who was also a soldier, serving on another ship. Ben missed his mother's cooking and talked about it every single day. Kethral did not understand any of this. Valorians did not form such attachments. Family was a biological necessity, nothing more. Soldiers did not speak of personal matters. It was considered weak and unprofessional, but the humans did not seem to care about looking weak. They laughed and argued and patted each other on the back. They asked Kethril questions about his homeworld, about his family, about his life. He answered with short words and tried to keep his distance. "You don't smile much, do you?" Ben asked him one evening. "Valorians do not smile," Kethril replied. "It serves no purpose." "Everything doesn't have to serve a purpose," Katie said. She was cleaning her rifle, her hands moving with practiced speed. "Sometimes things just feel good. Feelings are unreliable," Kethril said. "Logic is the only truth." Danny looked up from his work. His eyes were thoughtful. "Logic tells you when to retreat. Feelings tell you when to stay and fight. Both have their place." Kethril did not respond. He thought the human was wrong, but he did not wish to argue. The mission would be over soon, and he would return to his own people. He just had to survive this assignment, and these strange, emotional creatures. The Resolute Dawn arrived at the Sarath 4 3 days later. From orbit, the planet looked peaceful. Green forests covered most of the land, and blue oceans sparkled in the sunlight. There were cities scattered across the surface, filled with millions of innocent people. But Kethril knew that peace would not last. The Scorn were coming. They always came. And when they arrived, they would consume everything in their path. He checked his weapons and prepared for battle. Whatever happened next, he would face it with cold logic and iron discipline. That was the Valorian way. He did not know yet how wrong he was about everything. He did not know that the humans beside him would teach him lessons he never expected to learn. He did not know that in the fires of war, he would discover what true strength really meant. But he would learn. Soon, he would learn. The command center of the Resolute Dawn was filled with worried faces when Kethril entered. Officers from different species stood around a large holographic display, and none of them looked happy. The news from the surface was bad. Very bad. The Scorn had arrived 3 days earlier than expected. They had already broken through the outer colonies, killing thousands and destroying everything in their path. The planetary defense forces were falling back toward the capital city, where millions of refugees were gathering. People were running for their lives, and there was nowhere safe to go. Kethril studied the display with cold eyes. The Scorn were shown as red dots, spreading across the map like a disease. There were so many of them. Too many. The coalition forces were shown in blue, and they were badly outnumbered. "The council reinforcements are delayed," announced the ship's captain, a tall human with gray hair. His name was Captain Howard Cole. "We're looking at 2 weeks, minimum, before help arrives." A Gorath officer slammed his massive fist on the table. The Gorath were huge, powerful creatures with thick gray skin and 4 eyes. They were known as some of the best warriors in the galaxy, but even this Gorath looked worried. 2 weeks? He growled. "We cannot hold for 2 weeks. The numbers are impossible." A Mindari officer floated nearby, her translucent body glowing with soft purple light. The Mindari were psychic beings who could read thoughts and move objects with their minds. She spoke without moving her mouth, her voice appearing directly in everyone's head. "The logical choice is to evacuate what survivors we can and retreat to a more defensible position. Staying here is suicide," Kethril agreed. The math was simple. They did not have enough soldiers, enough ships, or enough time. A tactical retreat was the only sensible option. They could save some lives and fight another day. He waited for the humans to agree. Surely they could see the truth. Surely they understood that staying meant death. But the humans did not agree. Danny Vance stepped forward, his face hard as stone. Katie stood beside him, her arms crossed. Even young Ben was there, his jaw set with determination. "With respect," Danny said, his voice steady, "we're not leaving." The Gorath stared at him. "Did you not hear the numbers, human? This is a battle we cannot win." "I heard them," Danny replied, "and I'm still not leaving." "Explain yourself," the Mindari demanded. Danny pointed at the holographic map. His finger touched the capital city, where millions of red dots represented refugees. There are 4 million civilians in that city right now. Half of them are children. If we leave, they all die. Every single one. Many will die anyway, Kethril said. He did not mean to be cruel. He was simply stating facts. The scorn cannot be stopped with our current forces. Retreating now saves some lives. Staying saves none. Danny turned to look at him. There was something in the human's eyes that Kethril did not understand. It was not anger exactly. And it was not sadness. It was something deeper. Something burning. Where I come from, Danny said slowly. We don't measure victory by how many people we save. We measure it by how hard we tried to save them all. Those people down there are counting on us. They're scared and alone, and waiting for someone to help them. And you want me to fly away and leave them to die? It is the logical choice, Kethril insisted. Then logic can go to hell, Katie said sharply. We're soldiers. We fight. That's what we do. We hold the line, Ben added. His voice shook a little, but his words were firm. That's what my dad always said. When things get bad, you hold the line. Captain Cole listened to all of this in silence. Then he took a deep breath and made his decision. We stay, he said. We buy time for the evacuation ships to get those civilians out. Every hour we hold is another 1,000 lives saved. The Gorath officer shook his head. This is madness. Maybe, Cole replied. But it's the right kind of madness. The coalition forces landed on the surface that afternoon. Kethril walked down the ramp of the transport ship and felt the warm air of Thessara forth on his scales. The capital city rose in the distance, its tall buildings reaching toward the sky. Between the city and the hills, the coalition soldiers were setting up defensive positions. There were Valorians like Kethril, standing in perfect formation with their weapons ready. There were Gorath warriors, massive and powerful, carrying guns that most species could not even lift. There were Mindari floating above the ground, their psychic shields already forming around the camp. And there were humans, checking their weapons and talking to each other in low voices. Kethril watched the humans as they prepared. He expected to see fear. He expected to see doubt. Instead, he saw something else entirely. They were quiet, focused. Their jokes and laughter had stopped. Danny moved among his soldiers, checking their gear and speaking words of encouragement. Katie organized the ammunition supplies with cold efficiency. Ben helped the younger soldiers set up defensive barriers, his hands steady despite his fear. Something had changed in them. The emotional, talkative creatures he had met on the ship were gone. In their place were warriors preparing for battle. You are different now, Kethril said to Danny. The sergeant looked up at him. This is who we are when it matters, he said simply. When there's something worth fighting for, everything else falls away. You know we will probably die here. Danny nodded slowly. Yeah, I know. And you are not afraid? The human was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It showed a little girl with brown hair and a bright smile, holding a stuffed animal. That's my daughter, Lucy, Danny said. She's 6 years old. She lives on Earth, safe and sound, because people like me are out here keeping the darkness away from her. He put the photograph back in his pocket. I'm terrified, he admitted. But somewhere in that city, there are fathers with daughters just like mine. There are mothers holding their children, praying for someone to save them. How can I leave them? How can I fly away and live with myself? Kethril did not have an answer. We're going to fight, Danny continued. We're going to bleed and hurt, and maybe die. But those people are getting on those evacuation ships. Every last one of them. That's the mission. That's what matters. The sun began to set over the hills. In the distance, Kethril could hear the first sounds of the Scorn army approaching. It was a terrible sound, like a million insects screaming at once. The battle for Thessara IV was about to begin. Kethril checked his weapons and took his position beside the humans. He still thought they were foolish. He still thought this mission was illogical. But somewhere deep inside, in a place he did not know existed, something stirred. It was small, and strange, and unfamiliar. It almost felt like respect. The scorn came at dawn. Kethral had seen many enemies in his years as a warrior. He had fought pirates and rebels and creatures from the dark edges of space. But he had never seen anything like the scorn. They poured over the hills like a black wave, thousands upon thousands of them. Their bodies were covered in hard shells, the color of dried blood. They had too many legs and too many eyes, and their mouths were filled with teeth designed for tearing flesh. They did not walk or run. They scuttled, moving with horrible speed across the ground, and they screamed. Every single one of them screamed in a high-pitched voice that hurt Kethral's ears. It was the sound of the hive mind, the terrible intelligence that connected them all. They were not individual creatures. They were one mind in a million bodies, and that mind wanted only one thing: to consume. "Here they come," Danny shouted. "Hold your positions. Wait for my signal." The coalition forces stood ready behind their defensive walls. Energy shields flickered to life, casting blue light across the battlefield. Weapons powered up with electric hums. Every soldier, no matter their species, felt the cold grip of fear in their chest, but they did not run. The scorn reached the first line of defense and crashed against the shields like water hitting rocks. The shields held for a moment, then began to crack. Energy weapons fired into the swarm, cutting down dozens of creatures. But for every scorn that fell, 10 more took its place. "Shields failing," a Valorian officer shouted. "Sector 4 is compromised." "Send reinforcements to Sector 4, Danny ordered. "Katie, take your team and fill that gap." Katie grabbed her rifle and sprinted toward the breach. On it, Kethral found himself fighting beside the humans as the scorn broke through the first wall. He moved with the cold precision of his training, his 4 arms working together like a machine. 2 arms held rifles that fired without stopping. The other 2 arms carried blades that sliced through scorn bodies with deadly accuracy. He was a perfect killing machine. This was what Valorians were trained to be. But then he saw the humans fight, and everything he thought he knew about war changed forever. Danny Vance stood at the center of the line, firing his weapon with one hand while shouting orders with his voice. A scorn blade caught his side, cutting through his armor and drawing blood. Any Valorian would have fallen back to receive medical attention. That was the logical thing to do. Danny did not fall back. He roared in pain and anger, then grabbed the scorn that had wounded him and broke its neck with his bare hands. Blood ran down his side. But he kept fighting. His teeth were bared like an animal, and his eyes burned with something that was not logic. It was fury. Katie was even worse. She fought like a demon from the old stories, her body moving faster than should have been possible. When her rifle ran out of ammunition, she used it as a club. When the club broke, she pulled out a pistol. When the pistol was empty, she drew her combat knife. A young scorn killed a refugee who was running toward the evacuation zone. It was a child, no more than 10 years old, cut down before he could reach safety. Katie saw it happen. The sound she made was not a scream. It was something deeper, something older. It came from a place inside her that Kethral did not know humans possessed. She charged into the swarm of scorn with nothing but her knife, slashing and stabbing with wild fury. Any logical observer would have said she was dead. The numbers were against her. The creatures surrounded her completely, but she did not die. When she finally emerged from the swarm, she was covered in blood that was not her own. Behind her lay 15 dead scorn, their bodies torn apart by a single human female with a knife. Katie fell to her knees, breathing hard. Her knife was broken in her hand. But she was alive. "What was that?" Kethral asked. His voice was quiet, almost confused. "That was a mother's wrath," Danny said. He was still bleeding, but he still would not stop fighting. Katie lost a son 3 years ago. Disease took him. Every time she sees a child die, she sees her boy again. But that was suicide. She should have died. Danny smiled, and there was something terrible in that smile. Humans don't die easy when we're angry. We've got something inside us. Something old. When it wakes up, We become hard to kill. The battle continued through the morning. The coalition forces were pushed back, step by step, toward the city walls. The Gorath fought bravely, their massive bodies forming living shields against the Scorn. The Mindari used their psychic powers to slow the swarm, but their strength was fading. The Valorians fought with cold efficiency, but even they were overwhelmed by the numbers. But the humans never stopped. They were wounded and tired and dying, but they never stopped. When one fell, another took their place. When their weapons ran out, they found new weapons. When they had nothing left to fight with, they used their fists. Ben Torres was fighting beside Kethral when a Scorn broke through the line. The creature was huge, bigger than the others, with claws that could cut through metal. It was heading straight for a group of refugees who were loading onto an evacuation ship. Ben did not hesitate. He threw himself at the creature, wrapping his arms around its legs and bringing it down. The Scorn slashed his back, cutting deep into his flesh. Ben screamed in pain but did not let go. "Shoot it," he shouted at Kethral. "Shoot it now!" Kethral raised his rifle and fired. The Scorn's head exploded, and the creature fell dead. Ben collapsed on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Kethral rushed to his side, pressing his hands against the wound. "It was bad. Very bad." "Why did you do that?" Kethral demanded. "That was foolish. You could have died." Ben laughed weakly. "Those people would have died if I didn't. Seemed like a fair trade. Your life for strangers? That is not logical." "Maybe not." Ben coughed, and blood appeared on his lips. "But it felt right. That's what matters." Medics arrived and carried Ben away. Kethral watched them go, his yellow eyes troubled. He did not understand these humans. Their choices made no sense. They threw away their lives for people they did not know, for people who would never thank them or remember their names. It was irrational. It was foolish. And yet, somehow, it was also beautiful. The evacuation ships began to launch as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Thousands of refugees escaped into space, carried away from the death that consumed their world. Every ship that launched meant lives saved. Every hour the coalition held meant more survivors. By midday, the first wall had fallen completely. The coalition forces retreated to the second line of defense, leaving behind the bodies of their dead. Danny stood at the new line, his wound roughly bandaged, his rifle in his hands. Katie was beside him, her face hard as stone. The surviving soldiers gathered around them, exhausted, but unbroken. "They're not stopping," Katie said quietly. "Neither are we," Danny replied. Kethral took his place beside them. He did not know why. Logic told him to retreat, to save himself. But something stronger than logic held him in place. For the first time in his life, the Valorian chose to fight, not because it was smart, but because it was right. The Scorn charged again, and the humans met them with fire and fury. And Kethral fought beside them, no longer just an ally, but something closer to a friend. By the second night, everything was falling apart. The coalition that had stood so strong at dawn was now broken and bleeding. The Mindari had retreated to protect their few remaining psychics, who were too exhausted to fight. The Gorath were almost gone. Their mighty warriors cut down one by one, until only a handful remained. The Valorians had suffered terrible losses, and many of the survivors had pulled back to the ships to evacuate. Only the humans remained in full strength at the front lines, and even they were starting to break. Kethral sat in a ruined building, trying to bandage a wound on his arm. 3 of his 4 arms had been cut by Scorn claws, and his scales were cracked in a dozen places. He had never been hurt this badly in his entire life. Danny sat nearby, his back against a crumbling wall. His wound from the morning had opened again, and fresh blood soaked through his bandages. He looked 10 years older than he had 2 days ago. His eyes were hollow, and his hands shook slightly as he reloaded his rifle. "We should retreat," Kethral said. His voice was tired. "There is no shame in it now. We have held longer than anyone expected. We have saved many lives." But if we stay, we will all die. Danny did not answer at first. He just sat there, staring at the wall, his fingers moving slowly over the weapon in his hands. You know why I became a soldier? Danny finally asked. Kethral shook his head. He had never thought to ask. I had a little sister once, Danny continued. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Her name was Emma. She was 5 years younger than me. Smartest kid I ever knew. She wanted to be a scientist, wanted to discover new planets and new species. He paused, and Kethral saw something dark pass across his face. When I was 17, my family moved to a colony world on the edge of human space. It was supposed to be safe. The war with the Scorn was far away, just stories on the news. We thought we had nothing to worry about. Danny's hands stopped moving on his rifle. The Scorn came one night without warning. They overran the colony in 6 hours. The military was supposed to send help. They said reinforcements were coming. They said to hold on. 70, he looked at Kethral, and his eyes were filled with old pain. They never came. The generals decided the colony was not worth saving. Too small, too far away, too expensive to defend. They wrote off 10,000 people, including my family, including my little sister. Kethral felt something cold settle in his chest. What happened to her? I don't know, Danny admitted. I was at school on another planet when the attack happened. I survived because I wasn't there. My parents, my sister, everyone I grew up with, they all just disappeared. I never found out what happened to them. I never found a body to bury. He stood up slowly, painfully, and walked to the window. Outside, the Scorn were gathering for another attack. Their screams echoed across the battlefield. Every night for 15 years, I've wondered if Emma called for help before she died. I've wondered if she waited for someone to come save her. I've wondered if she died alone and scared, thinking that nobody cared enough to fight for her. Danny turned back to face Kethral. There were tears in his eyes, but his voice was steady. I won't be the reason someone else's sister dies tonight. I won't be the soldier who flies away because the math doesn't work out. Those people in this city are counting on us. And even if I die here, at least I'll die knowing I tried. He loaded his rifle with a sharp click. So no, Kethral. We're not retreating. We're going to hit them at dawn. One last push to give the evacuation ships time to launch. We're going to buy every second we can with our blood. That is suicide, Kethral said. Probably, Danny agreed. You coming or not? Kethral looked at this human, this small and fragile creature who had every reason to run but chose to stay. He thought about logic and survival, and all the cold calculations that had guided his life. Then he thought about a 5-year-old girl named Emma, waiting for help that never came. I am coming, Kethral said. The attack began at first light. The remaining human soldiers and the handful of aliens who stayed with them charged out of their defensive positions and straight into the Scorn swarm. It was not a strategy that any military school would teach. It was madness. But it was glorious madness. Kethral ran beside Danny and Katie, his weapons blazing. Ben was there too, despite his wounds from the day before. The medics had patched him up as best they could, and he had refused to stay behind. If this is the end, Ben had said, I want to face it standing up. The Scorn met them with claws and teeth and screaming fury. Bodies fell on both sides. The ground became slippery with blood. The air was filled with smoke and death. In the chaos of battle, Kethral lost sight of the others. He fought alone, surrounded by enemies, his arms moving faster than thought. He killed dozens of Scorn, but more kept coming. They were endless. A tide of death that could not be stopped. Then he heard Ben's voice. Kethral, behind you! He turned and saw a massive Scorn warrior lunging at him, its claws aimed at his heart. There was no time to dodge, no time to raise his weapon, but Ben was there. The young human threw himself between Kethral and the Scorn. The creature's blade went through Ben's chest instead. The boy gasped in pain. But even as he died, he raised his pistol and shot the Scorn through the skull. Both fell to the ground. The Scorn was dead, and Ben was dying. Kethral dropped to his knees beside the young human. Blood was pouring from Ben's wound, too much blood. There was nothing anyone could do. Why? Kethril demanded. Why did you do that? I am not your family. I am not even your friend. Ben smiled weakly. His face was very pale, and his breath came in short gasps. You were fighting beside us. That makes you family. You fool. You stupid, irrational fool. Got him, though, Ben whispered. His eyes were starting to close. Tell my mom. Tell her I got him. Tell her I did good. Ben. But Ben Torres was gone. His eyes stared up at the smoke-filled sky, seeing nothing. He was 22 years old, and he had died to save someone he had known for only a few days. Kethril knelt there in the dirt, holding the body of a human who had given everything for him. Something cracked inside the Valorian, something cold and hard that he had carried his whole life, and in its place, something new was born. It started as heat in his chest, spreading through his body like fire. His hands began to shake. His vision turned red at the edges. His hearts beat faster and faster until he could hear them pounding in his ears. This was not logic. This was not discipline. This was something the Valorians did not have a word for. But the humans did. They called it wrath. Kethril stood up slowly. His 4 arms gripped his weapons with new strength. His yellow eyes blazed with a fury he had never known before. The scorn had killed this boy. This brave, foolish, beautiful boy who had died to save him. And now the scorn would pay. Kethril screamed. It was not a Valorian battle cry. It was something raw and primal and terrible. It was the sound of a creature who had learned to hate. And then he charged into the swarm, no longer fighting to survive, but fighting to destroy. The humans had given him their wrath. Now he would show them how to use it. The final stand took place at the spaceport gates. Behind those gates, the last evacuation ships were loading refugees. Thousands of people, mostly children and elderly, were climbing aboard the vessels that would carry them to safety. The engines were warming up. The pilots were ready. They just needed a few more minutes. But the scorn were everywhere. The swarm had broken through the final defensive line and was now racing toward the spaceport. If they reached the gates before the ships launched, everyone would die. 4 years of running and fighting and hoping would end in blood and screams. Kethril stood at the gates with the surviving soldiers. There were maybe 50 of them left. Humans. Mostly. A few Valorians. 2 Gorath warriors who refused to retreat. 1 Mindari who had given everything she had and could barely float anymore. They were exhausted. They were wounded. They were dying. But they were not going to move. Danny was at the front, where he had always been. His armor was torn and stained with blood. His left arm hung useless at his side, but his right hand still held his rifle, and his eyes still burned with that human fire. Katie stood beside him. She had run out of ammunition an hour ago, and had been fighting with whatever she could find. Right now, she held a piece of broken metal that she had sharpened into a blade. Her red hair was matted with blood and dirt. This is it, Danny said. His voice was calm. We hold until the ships are gone. Not one step back. Not one step back, the soldiers repeated. The scorn charged. What happened next would become a legend told across 100 worlds. 50 soldiers met an army of thousands. They should have been crushed in seconds. They should have been swept away like leaves in a storm, but they were not. The humans fought with a fury that defied all logic. They were not trying to win anymore. They were not trying to survive. They were simply trying to make the enemy pay for every inch of ground. Danny killed so many scorn that their bodies piled up around him like a wall. When his rifle finally broke, he picked up a fallen Gorath's weapon and kept firing. When that weapon failed, he used his fists. His broken arm swung uselessly, but his good arm never stopped moving. Katie was a demon made flesh. She danced through the swarm with her makeshift blade, cutting and slashing with perfect precision. The scorn learned to fear her. They actually pulled back when she advanced, something that the hive mind had never done before. And Kethril fought beside them, screaming in the human tongue he had learned, honoring the dead boy who had saved his life. The wrath that Ben had given him burned in his chest like a star. He had never felt anything like it. It was terrible and beautiful and completely, utterly irrational. And he would not trade it for anything. The minutes passed like hours. Soldiers fell one by one. The Gorath warriors went down fighting, taking dozens of scorn with them. The Mindari spent the last of her energy, creating a psychic shield that held just long enough for the final ship to seal its doors. The Valorians died with something new in their eyes, something they had learned from the humans beside them. Then a sound cut through the chaos. The roar of engines, the scream of thrusters. The evacuation ships were launching. Kethral looked up and saw them rising into the sky, carrying their precious cargo of survivors. Mothers holding children. Old men who had seen too much. Young people who still had lives to live. 4 million people escaped Thesara IV that day. 4 million lives saved because 50 soldiers refused to take one step back. The Scorn Swarm hesitated. Their prey was escaping, and there was nothing they could do about it. For a moment, just a moment, they stopped their attack. In that moment of silence, Danny Vance fell. He had taken too many wounds, lost too much blood. His body simply could not continue any longer. He collapsed to the ground, his rifle falling from his hand. Kethral was at his side in an instant. He gathered the human in his arms, careful not to hurt him further. But he could see the truth in Danny's eyes. There was no saving him now. "Did they make it?" Danny whispered. His voice was barely audible. "The ships?" Kethral looked up at the sky, where the evacuation vessels were disappearing into the clouds. "They made it," he said. "All of them. You saved them all." Danny smiled. It was a tired smile. A dying smile. But it was peaceful. "Good. That's good. Good." He reached up with his good hand and grabbed Kethral's arm. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear. "You're all right, friend," Danny said. "For a cold-blooded lizard, you're all right." Then his hand fell, and Danny Vance was gone. Kethral held him for a long moment, feeling something wet on his face. He did not know what it was. Valorians did not cry. They did not have tears, but apparently, that was no longer true. The Council reinforcements arrived 2 hours later. Their massive warships descended from the sky and unleashed fire upon the Scorn Swarm. The battle was over in minutes. The enemy that had seemed so unstoppable was scattered and destroyed. The soldiers who found Kethral had to pry Danny's body from his arms. The Valorian refused to let go at first. He sat in the ruins of the spaceport, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen comrades, and he refused to move. Katie survived. She had 17 wounds and had lost 3 fingers, but she survived. She sat beside Kethral as the medics treated her, saying nothing. When they finally put Danny's body on a stretcher and covered him with a flag, Katie reached out and touched the fabric gently. "He was the best of us," she said quietly. Kethral could only nod. 3 months later, Kethral stood before the Galactic Council. The Great Chamber was filled with representatives from 100 species. They had gathered to hear his report on the Battle of Thesara IV. He was the only Valorian who had stayed until the end. He was the only one who could tell them what really happened. The council leader, an ancient being with silver skin and wise eyes, gestured for him to speak. "Tell us about the humans," the leader said. "We have heard stories. We want to know the truth." Kethral was silent for a long moment. He thought about Danny and Katie and Ben. He thought about that final stand at the spaceport gates. He thought about the wrath that had burned in his chest and still flickered there like an ember. Then he spoke. "The humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the fastest or the smartest or the most advanced. By every measure we use to judge worth, they are average." He paused. "But you are all fools if you think that makes them weak." The council shifted uncomfortably. This was not what they expected. The humans carry something inside them that we do not understand. When you threaten what they love, when you harm their children, their families, their friends, something wakes up in them, something ancient, something terrible. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of every species that had ever dismissed humanity as unimportant. "I watched a young human throw himself onto an enemy blade to save my life. I watched a wounded sergeant fight for 16 hours without rest because he refused to let strangers die. I watched 50 soldiers hold back an army because running away was not something they could live with. Kethral's voice grew harder. Do not make enemies of the humans. Do not threaten what they love. Because when you wake the wrath that sleeps inside them, it does not stop. It does not negotiate. It does not count the odds or calculate the costs. He leaned forward. It simply destroys everything that threatened its people, or it dies trying. And even then, it does not stop easily. The chamber was completely silent. That is my report, Kethral said. The humans are not just another species to be measured and ranked. They are something else entirely. And if you are wise, you will remember that. He turned and walked out of the chamber, leaving the council in stunned silence. Across the galaxy, in the dark spaces between stars, the Scorn Collective processed this new information. They had lost at the Thesara. They had been stopped by creatures they had considered prey. The hive mind added humanity to a very short list. It was a list of species to avoid. Species that were more trouble than they were worth. Species that fought beyond all reason and logic. The Scorn would find easier targets. There were other worlds to consume, but humanity was no longer on the menu. And on a small planet called Earth, a little girl named Lucy Vance received a medal on behalf of her father. She did not fully understand why he was gone, or why everyone kept calling him a hero. She only knew that her daddy had been a soldier, and soldiers kept people safe. Someday, when she was older, she would learn the truth. She would learn about Thesara 4th and the stand at the spaceport gates. She would learn that her father had saved 4 million lives because he remembered his little sister and refused to let history repeat itself. And she would understand why humans were feared across the stars. Not because they were strong, because they were willing to die for each other. And there was nothing in the universe more dangerous than that.